Hi everyone, welcome to the channel After All That Years.
The moment my wife Caroline walked through our front door after her 4-day business trip, I knew something fundamental had changed. I just didn't realize she'd been planning to destroy our 10-year marriage for months. My name is Frederick, and looking back now, I can see all the warning signs I chose to ignore. The late-night phone calls she'd take in another room, the way she'd suddenly close her laptop when I entered her office, the new clothes that appeared in her closet without explanation. But when you've shared a decade of your life with someone, when you've built what you thought was an unshakable partnership, you find ways to rationalize the inconsistencies. Caroline worked as a regional manager for a digital marketing company, and her travel schedule had become increasingly demanding over the past 6 months. This particular trip was supposed to be routine, 4 days in Charleston for some industry conference. Nothing glamorous, she'd assured me while folding her business attire into her suitcase. Just seminars and networking sessions. Her casual dismissal of the trip should have been my first clue. I kissed her goodbye that Tuesday morning, wished her safe travels, and watched her drive away in her silver Honda. The house felt different in her absence, though I couldn't pinpoint why. There was an undercurrent of tension I'd been feeling for weeks, a sense that Caroline was mentally somewhere else, even when she was sitting right beside me. At first, I attributed her distance to work pressure. Her company was aggressively pursuing larger accounts, and she often came home drained from client dinners and late meetings. I tried to be understanding, supportive even. She was my wife, and I trusted her completely. That trust was about to be obliterated. When Caroline returned Friday evening, everything about her radiated a kind of energy I hadn't seen in years. She practically glowed as she walked through the door, her laughter echoing through our entryway with an almost theatrical quality. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her clothes immaculate, despite supposedly spending hours in airports and conference rooms. She didn't look like someone returning from a grueling work commitment. She looked like someone who just experienced the time of her life. "Frederick, you wouldn't believe the week I've had," she exclaimed, dropping her black roller bag by the entrance with unusual carelessness. Her cheeks were flushed, her smile impossibly wide, and there was something in her eyes I couldn't identify. A spark that hadn't been there when she left. "You look energized," I managed, though something in my stomach was already starting to twist. "Must have been quite the conference." "Oh, it was incredible," she replied, tossing her blazer over the back of our dining chair. "The presentations were fantastic, and I met some absolutely fascinating people. You know how crucial networking is in this industry." She began chattering about marketing strategies and keynote speakers, but I found myself studying her face rather than listening to her words. There was something different about her demeanor, not just happiness, but a kind of secretive satisfaction that made my skin crawl. As she spoke, I noticed her suitcase still sitting exactly where she'd dropped it. Normally, Caroline was meticulous about unpacking immediately after any trip, hanging her clothes and organizing her toiletries within minutes of walking through the door. Her sudden indifference to her luggage struck me as completely out of character. "You must be exhausted," I said, gesturing toward the suitcase. "Let me carry that upstairs for you." The moment I reached for the handle, Caroline's entire demeanor shifted. "Oh, don't worry about that," she said quickly, her voice taking on an edge I rarely heard. "I'll take care of it later." I froze. Caroline had never been possessive about her luggage before. She'd always appreciated when I helped with the heavy lifting, especially after long trips. Her sudden defensiveness sent alarm bells ringing in my head. "Are you sure?" I pressed, trying to keep my tone casual. "It's no trouble." "I'm sure," she replied, forcing that brilliant smile back onto her face. "Why don't you make us some tea? I'm dying to just sit and relax." I retreated to the kitchen, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to ask. Why was she guarding that suitcase so carefully? What could possibly be inside that she didn't want me to see? And why did every instinct I possessed tell me that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong? I prepared the tea with trembling hands, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. But as I carried the cups back to our living room and saw Caroline sitting on our couch, still glancing nervously at her suitcase by the door, I knew my instincts were trying to warn me about something I wasn't ready to face. "So tell me about the conference," I said, settling into my usual chair across from her. "Did anything particularly interesting happen?" Her eyes flickered for just a moment before she launched into what sounded like a rehearsed response about industry trends and networking opportunities. But there was something hollow about her words, something that felt more like performance than genuine recollection. I nodded along, making appropriate comments and asking follow-up questions, but my attention kept drifting to that suitcase. Whatever Caroline was hiding, the answer was right there, barely 20 feet away from where we sat. That night, long after Caroline had gone to bed claiming exhaustion from her trip, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. Her steady breathing beside me should have been comforting, but instead it felt like the soundtrack to my growing unease. Every fiber of my being was telling me that the woman lying next to me was harboring secrets that could destroy everything we'd built together. By 2 a.m, I couldn't stand it anymore. I slipped out of bed as quietly as possible, my heart hammering in my chest as I made my way downstairs. The house was silent except for the familiar creaking of old wooden floors beneath my feet. Caroline's suitcase sat exactly where she'd left it, like a black monolith in our entryway. I stood there for several minutes, wrestling with my conscience. What I was considering felt like a violation of her privacy, a betrayal of the trust that should exist between married partners. But that trust was already fractured, wasn't it? Her behavior, her defensiveness, her obvious lies about the nature of her trip, everything pointed to the fact that Caroline was already betraying me in ways I was only beginning to understand. I unzipped the suitcase with trembling fingers, careful not to make any noise that might wake her. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Business clothes, toiletries, a pair of low heels she wore to professional events. But as I carefully moved items aside, my fingers encountered something that made my blood turn to ice. Hidden beneath a silk blouse was a small velvet jewelry pouch. I'd never seen it before, and Caroline had never mentioned purchasing any new jewelry. With shaking hands, I opened the pouch to reveal a delicate gold necklace with a heart-shaped pendant. It wasn't hers. I knew every piece of jewelry my wife owned, and this wasn't among them. The pendant was far too delicate for Caroline's taste. She preferred bold statement pieces that commanded attention. But what made my stomach drop was the inscription on the back of the heart, "To my beloved, always yours, M." M. Who was M? And why was my wife carrying love jewelry from someone else? But that wasn't the most damaging discovery. Beneath the jewelry pouch, I found a receipt that made the room start spinning around me. It was from an upscale restaurant in Charleston's historic district, dated 3 nights ago. The details were unmistakable. A reservation for 2 at a romantic corner table, complete with champagne service and dessert. Caroline had told me she was working late that particular evening, attending a mandatory networking dinner with her colleagues. But this receipt told a very different story. This was an intimate dinner for 2, the kind of evening couples share when they're celebrating something special. I sat down hard on our entryway floor, clutching the necklace and receipt in my hands. My mind was reeling, trying to process what I was seeing. Caroline hadn't just lied about working late, she'd been on what could only be described as a romantic date with someone else. Someone whose initial was M. I wanted to storm upstairs, to shake her awake and demand explanations. But some deeper instinct told me I needed more information before I confronted her. Caroline was intelligent and articulate. If I approached her with only partial evidence, she'd find a way to explain it away or turn the situation back on me. I carefully replaced everything in the suitcase exactly as I'd found it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the zipper. Then I retreated to the kitchen, poured myself a generous glass of bourbon, and tried to make sense of what I'd discovered. The next morning arrived grey and drizzling, matching my mood perfectly. Caroline bounced downstairs with the same inexplicable energy she'd displayed the night before, humming to herself as she prepared coffee and toast. She kissed my cheek with casual affection, chattering about her plans for the day, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Every smile, every casual touch, every mundane comment felt like a performance designed to cover up something much darker. "I should probably do some laundry today," she said, glancing toward her suitcase. "Get back into my normal routine after being away." I watched her carefully over the rim of my coffee mug. "Take your time, there's no rush." After she left for work, I went straight back to that suitcase. This time, I was more systematic in my search, and what I found made my previous discoveries seem trivial by comparison. Hidden in a side compartment, beneath a scarf I'd given her for Christmas 2 years ago, was a cell phone I'd never seen before. A cheap prepaid model that Caroline had obviously been using for communications she didn't want appearing on our regular phone bill. My hands trembled as I powered it on. The screen lit up to reveal a series of text messages from a contact saved simply as M. The most recent exchange made me physically sick. Missing you already. Last night was beyond incredible. I can still smell your perfume on my shirt. Can't wait to see you again. Our secret is safe. Don't forget, what happens in Charleston stays in Charleston. I scrolled through weeks of messages, each one more damaging than the last. This wasn't a recent development. Caroline had been carrying on with this M person for months. The messages revealed elaborate planning, careful coordination, and a level of intimacy that made me want to throw the phone across the room. But the worst discovery was yet to come. Buried in the phone's photo gallery were images that destroyed any remaining doubt about what was happening. Pictures of Caroline with a man I didn't recognize, both of them clearly in hotel rooms, both of them looking radiantly happy in ways that Caroline hadn't looked with me in years. The man was tall, athletic, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of confident smile that suggested he was used to getting what he wanted. In every photo, he and Caroline looked like lovers celebrating a perfect weekend getaway, which I realized with sickening clarity was exactly what they'd been doing. I sat there in our living room, scrolling through evidence of my wife's betrayal, feeling like I was watching my entire life collapse in real time. 10 years of marriage, 10 years of trust and partnership and shared dreams. All of it had been a lie, at least for Caroline. That evening, when she returned from work with her usual cheerful demeanor, I could barely look at her. Every word she spoke felt like another small knife being twisted in my chest. She asked about my day, shared amusing stories from her office, even suggested we order pizza and watch a movie together. All while the evidence of her affair sat hidden upstairs in her suitcase. I made it through dinner by focusing on my food and giving non-committal responses to her conversation. But as we sat on the couch afterward, Caroline curled against my side while some romantic comedy played on television, I finally reached my breaking point. "Caroline," I said, my voice sounding strange and hollow to my own ears. "Who is M?" The effect was immediate and dramatic. She went completely rigid beside me, her entire body freezing as if I'd just announced the house was on fire. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't even seem to be processing what I'd said. Then she sat up slowly, her face carefully blank. "What are you talking about?" she asked, but her voice was pitched slightly too high, and she couldn't quite meet my eyes. "Don't lie to me," I said quietly. "I found the messages. I know about the necklace, the dinner, everything." For several seconds, we stared at each other in complete silence. I could see her mind racing, trying to figure out how much I actually knew, how much damage control she'd need to attempt. Finally, she laughed, a cold, bitter sound that sent chills down my spine. "You think you know everything, Frederick. You don't know the first thing about what's really going on here." And with those words, she stood up and walked out of the room, leaving me sitting alone on our couch with the terrible certainty that my marriage was over. But as it turned out, I really didn't know everything. Not yet. Caroline's cryptic words haunted me through another sleepless night. "You don't know the first thing about what's really going on here." What could she possibly mean? What else could there be beyond the affair, beyond the lies, beyond the systematic destruction of everything I thought we'd built together? The next morning, I waited until Caroline left for work before beginning a more thorough investigation. If she thought I was only scratching the surface, then I was determined to uncover whatever deeper truth she was hiding. I started with her laptop, which she'd carelessly left open on our kitchen counter. Caroline had always been somewhat careless with her digital security around me. After 10 years of marriage, she'd never had reason to think I'd go through her personal accounts. That carelessness was about to cost her everything. Her email revealed a trail of deception that went back much further than I'd imagined. Buried in a folder labeled Work Projects were months of correspondence with someone named Marcus, clearly the mysterious M from her phone. Marcus wasn't some random stranger she'd met at a conference. As I read through their exchanges, I realized with growing horror that he was Caroline's high school boyfriend, someone she'd mentioned occasionally in our early dating years, but whom I'd assumed was ancient history. Their reunion had apparently happened 6 months ago at their 20-year high school reunion, an event Caroline had attended alone while I was traveling for my own work. What started as nostalgia had quickly evolved into something much more dangerous. The emails chronicled the development of their relationship with painful detail. Marcus lived in Charleston, which explained Caroline's sudden increase in business trips to that city. He owned a small construction company and lived what appeared to be a fairly comfortable bachelor lifestyle. But what made my stomach turn were the intimate details Caroline shared about our marriage, our life together, and most devastatingly, about me. "Frederick is exactly what you'd expect," she'd written in one particularly cruel message. "Predictable, boring, completely clueless about what's happening right under his nose. Sometimes I think I could bring you to dinner and he'd just assume you were another work colleague." Another message, sent just days before her most recent trip, was even worse. "I can't wait to get away from this suffocating life. Frederick thinks everything is fine, but I've been planning my exit strategy for months. Soon I won't have to pretend anymore." Exit strategy. The words hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just an affair, it was a calculated plan to end our marriage on her terms, probably leaving me blindsided and financially devastated. But I wasn't done discovering the depth of her betrayal. Hidden in her browser history, I found evidence that Caroline had been researching divorce attorneys, asset protection strategies, and even articles about how to hide money during divorce proceedings. She'd been planning to destroy me, and I'd been completely oblivious. That afternoon, I called in sick to work and drove to the office of a private investigator I found through an online search. Gerald Hutchins was a former police detective who specialized in matrimonial investigations, and his no-nonsense demeanor immediately put me at ease. I laid out everything I'd discovered: the phone, the emails, the jewelry, the receipts. Gerald listened without judgment, taking occasional notes and asking clarifying questions. "How long do you think this has been going on?" he asked when I finished. "At least 6 months, maybe longer," I replied. "But there might be things I haven't found yet." Gerald nodded grimly. "There usually are. Give me a week and I'll have everything you need to protect yourself." A week felt like an eternity, but I forced myself to maintain normalcy at home. Caroline continued her cheerful charade, chatting about work and making plans for upcoming weekends as if she weren't systematically planning to destroy our life together. The hardest part was pretending everything was fine when she suggested we take a romantic getaway together. "I was thinking maybe we could go to Charleston," she said over dinner one evening, her voice carefully casual. "I know the city pretty well now from all my work trips, and there are some lovely restaurants I'd love to show you." The audacity of her suggestion left me speechless. She wanted to take me to the scene of her betrayal, to show me the restaurants where she'd been dining with Marcus, to share a bed with me in the same city where she'd been carrying on her affair. "That sounds nice," I managed to say, though the words tasted like ash in my mouth. "Let's talk about it this weekend." But I had no intention of going to Charleston with Caroline. By the weekend, I planned to have all the ammunition I needed to end this charade permanently. Gerald called me exactly 1 week after our initial meeting. "Can you come in this afternoon?" he asked. "I've got everything you need, and more." His office felt different when I returned, heavier somehow, as if the weight of what he'd discovered was pressing down on the very air in the room. Gerald spread a series of photographs across his desk, each one more damaging than the last. Caroline and Marcus entering hotel rooms together. Caroline and Marcus sharing intimate dinners at expensive restaurants. Caroline and Marcus walking hand in hand through Charleston's historic district like tourists on their honeymoon. But the most devastating evidence was financial. Gerald had traced charges on our joint credit card, charges I'd never noticed because Caroline handled most of our bookkeeping. She'd been using our shared money to fund her affair, paying for hotel rooms, expensive dinners, even gifts for Marcus. "She's been stealing from you to pay for her betrayal," Gerald said bluntly. "But there's more." He handed me a folder containing phone records, bank statements, and what appeared to be legal documents. "Your wife has been moving money out of your joint accounts and into a separate account she opened 3 months ago. She's also been in contact with a divorce attorney, planning what looks like a surprise attack." I stared at the evidence, feeling numb. "She's going to blindside me." "That was the plan," Gerald confirmed. "But now you know what's coming. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" That night, as Caroline chatted about her day over dinner, I studied her face with new eyes. Everything about her felt like an elaborate performance. Her smile, her laugh, even her casual touches. She was already gone, mentally and emotionally. She was just waiting for the right moment to make it official. But I wasn't going to let her control that narrative anymore. "Caroline," I said suddenly, interrupting her story about some office drama, "we need to talk." She looked at me with curious eyes, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. "Of course, what's on your mind?" I pulled out my phone and set it on the table between us. On the screen was one of Gerald's photographs, Caroline and Marcus kissing passionately outside a Charleston hotel. The color drained from her face instantly. Her fork clattered to her plate, and for the first time since she'd returned from her trip, Caroline looked genuinely rattled. "Frederick," she started, but I held up my hand to stop her. "Don't," I said quietly. "Don't insult me by trying to explain this away." She stared at the photograph, her mouth opening and closing silently. I could see her mind racing, trying to figure out how much I knew, how much damage control would be possible. "How long?" I asked. "How long what?" she whispered. "How long have you been planning to destroy our marriage?" Her eyes filled with tears, but I felt no sympathy. Those tears weren't genuine remorse, they were the tears of someone who'd been caught and was facing consequences she'd never expected to confront. "It's not what you think," she said finally. I laughed, a sound devoid of any humor. "It's exactly what I think. You've been having an affair with Marcus for months, you've been stealing money from our joint accounts to pay for it, and you've been planning to divorce me without warning." Her face went completely white. "How do you know about Marcus?" "I know everything, Caroline. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" She sat there for a long moment, tears streaming down her face, before her expression hardened. "You want to know the truth, Frederick? Fine. Yes, I've been seeing Marcus. Yes, I've been planning to leave you. And you know why? Because you're not the man I married. You're boring, predictable, and completely oblivious to what I need." Her words stung, but I kept my expression steady. "What you needed was honesty. What you needed was to end our marriage before you started a new relationship. What you did instead was lie, cheat, and steal." "I never meant for it to happen this way," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Yes, you did," I replied. "You planned all of this. The only thing you didn't plan for was getting caught." I stood up from the table, leaving her sitting there with tears streaming down her face. "I'll be staying in the guest room tonight. Tomorrow we'll discuss the terms of our divorce. And Caroline, I suggest you get yourself a very good attorney, because you're going to need one." The next morning, Caroline was gone. She'd packed a single suitcase and left some time before dawn, leaving behind only a note saying she was staying with a friend and would contact me through her lawyer. But I was already ahead of her. While she'd been packing, I'd been on the phone with my own attorney, ensuring that our joint accounts were frozen and that Caroline couldn't access any more of our shared assets. The divorce proceedings that followed were brutal but swift. Faced with overwhelming evidence of her affair and financial misconduct, Caroline had little choice but to accept a settlement heavily weighted in my favor. She lost the house, most of our savings, and any claim to my retirement accounts. Marcus, it turned out, wasn't the successful businessman Caroline had thought he was. His construction company was barely breaking even, and he'd been financing his lavish lifestyle through credit cards and loans. When Caroline showed up at his door, expecting to start their new life together, she discovered that her fantasy was built on lies as elaborate as the ones she told me. 6 months after our divorce was finalized, I heard through mutual friends that Caroline and Marcus had broken up. She was living in a small apartment across town, working a job that paid half what she'd been making before, struggling to rebuild a life she'd destroyed through her own choices. I felt no satisfaction in her downfall, but I felt no sympathy either. Caroline had made her decisions, and now she was living with the consequences. As for me, I was finally free. Free from the lies, free from the constant tension of living with someone who was systematically betraying me, free to rebuild my life on honest foundations. It took time, months of therapy, reconnecting with friends I'd neglected, rediscovering interests Caroline had never shared. But gradually, I began to feel like myself again. Not the man I'd been during my marriage, but someone stronger, someone who'd learned hard lessons about trust and self-respect. The house felt different now, not empty, but peaceful. I could sit in my living room without wondering what secrets were being hidden from me. I could check my bank statements without discovering mysterious charges. I could sleep soundly without worrying about what lies I'd be told in the morning. One evening, as I sat on my front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, I realized that Caroline had inadvertently given me a gift. Her betrayal had been devastating, but it had also shown me what I was truly made of. I'd faced the worst kind of personal crisis and emerged intact. I wasn't the boring, predictable man she'd described in her cruel emails. I was someone who'd fought back when attacked, someone who'd refused to be destroyed by another person's selfishness. I was someone who deserved better than what I'd been accepting. And for the first time in years, I was genuinely happy with the man I saw in the mirror. Caroline's affair had ended our marriage, but it had also begun something new, my journey back to self-respect and genuine contentment. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was a life built on truth rather than lies, and that made all the difference.